The following program originally appeared on Tor.com and is being resyndicated here by IO9.
Welcome to the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Hosted by John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 8 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today we'll be talking with author Blake Charlton. His first novel, Spellwright, about a dyslexic young wizard, will be out on March 2nd from Tor Books. So today we'll be talking with Blake about how his love of fantasy literature helped him to overcome his own dyslexia. In addition to being a novelist, he's currently a medical student at Stanford. I think especially if you know any kids who are struggling with reading, I think you'll definitely want to listen to this interview. And Blake is just a really nice guy. You know, John and I met him at Worldcon a couple years ago, and he just happened to be sitting next to us in the audience at a panel, and we got to talking, and you know, we like him, and we hope his first book does really well, and we think that you'll like him too after listening to this interview. And so stick around after the interview, where John and I will be talking about magic and medicine and fiction. But so now let's get to our interview.
All right, let's get Blake on the phone.
Hello?
Hi, this is Dave and John from Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Gents, how is it?
Good. So first of all, could you tell us a little bit about growing up with dyslexia? Did you get diagnosed right away, and do you feel that the adults in your life handled your condition properly?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. I was a member of what some of us call like Generation Zero, meaning that from the youngest age, people suspected that we were neurodivergent or neuroatypical. I got my testing when I was in first grade, which is pretty mind-boggling, amazing, and was really wonderful because everyone was able to diagnose me so quickly. I was immediately placed into a special ed classroom, which has its pros and its cons, and was very formative in my worldview. But it did allow everyone to know very quickly what the problem was. Like, some of the people I respect most in this world are people that have the same diagnosis that I had, but the diagnosis wasn't made until they were, you know, in their 20s or 30s, and had pretty much learned how to cope all by themselves.
So how do you experience dyslexia? Like, what are you...
So dyslexia is a really interesting kind of condition. It's not so much a disease as a condition. It's a mismatch between kind of a mind and a language. The thing that really just baked my cookie when I heard it was that in certain languages there are more dyslexics than in others. For example, and I might flub the exact statistics, but I believe there are 1/3 the number per capita of dyslexics in Italian-speaking populations than there are in English-speaking populations. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with the degeneracy of the phonetic code. If you want to think about English and the phoneme that makes a f sound, there are plenty of ways. There are just a grotesque number of ways to encode for a f sound. You could do it with an F, which would be sensible. You can do it with a PH, which you might argue is also sensible. But you can also do it with an OUGH, like enough. Whereas I believe in Italian, you can only do it in F. Photograph, I believe, is spelled with 2 Fs.
Were there any books in particular that really motivated you to keep reading despite the difficulty?
So, like, I wasn't reading. I could read stop signs. I could pretty much get along without being identified outside of the classroom. But inside of the classroom, I was in remedial level everything. And I could not read to myself. I was a huge fan of comic books, still am, and graphic novels. I remember we went to Europe when I was younger, and I was very much into the Asterix and Obelix comic books, and I would buy them in French or Italian or whatever because I couldn't read the words anyway. Mm-hmm. You know, my parents really, like, are saints, and they should both be canonized. What they did was they started to read to me. It was like required. I had to be read to every night, and they read in front of me. And they picked wonderful, wonderful stories. And somewhere, you know, when I was around 10, my father started reading the Robert Jordan books around me. and he noticed how excited I was, and they would read a little less every night, or he would suddenly, all of a sudden, his eyes would become too tired to go on at like the most like exciting part ever. And I was just sent into like these fits of agony, needing to know what happened. But he'd leave, and he'd leave the book. And so, science fiction and fantasy first, really kind of saved me. I was not into school. I wanted to get out of school. I was the most obnoxious, angry little boy you ever saw. But within the space of a year, I was sneaking, Robert Jordan, Robin Hobb, Tad Williams into special ed study hall. And when I was supposed to be writing out all these spelling drills, I would surreptitiously read, Ender's Game or The Eye of the World under my desk. It literally saved my life. Well, at least my educational life. There was nothing my parents were able to do that had motivated me so much as this particular body of literature.
So how did you get interested in writing fiction?
So, writing came to me very late. I was always, I kind of just habitually was a storyteller. I remember being very young, and I would ask my sister to write down the things I came up with. And she would sometimes do it and sometimes kind of pretend to do it because, the scratch marks she made on the page, I couldn't tell what they were anyway. But it was just kind of a habit. And it only ever really, the idea of writing only ever came to me rather embarrassingly when I was like maybe a sophomore in high school. And I started writing for my high school's literary magazine. And I shudder to think if there are, thank God the internet wasn't around then to immortalize whatever I was writing.
Before writing Spellwright, your first novel, had you written other novels or short stories or anything before starting?
So I was always written for fun and for the closet. I wouldn't dare show it to anybody else. I was also like I was the rabid pre-med you did not want to know in college. When I got into college, I was dead sure that I was an admission mistake. There was no other dyslexics I knew of at my college. I thought I was going to get kicked out. So everything I did at school was intensely practical. I never took a creative writing course. I never would have submitted any kind of creative writing to anything. But the dean of my college, I went to Yale University, and within the university there are separate colleges. It's kind of like Hogwarts, but with a lot more beer. The dean of my college was a good friend of mine, and I had the guts to show her a draft, and she said, you simply have to write this. And so being kind of foolish, being 21 and thinking I had forever, and why not you just write a book and it gets published, right? I dove right in, and Spellwright was the first thing I ever wrote.
So how long was it from the time you first got the idea to the time the book actually is coming out?
Let's see. I began my junior year of college, and I was 21 at the time, and it will publish in the U.S. March 2nd, and I am now 30 years old. So it's been a long, long haul.
So that's sort of Lord of the Rings time scale there.
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the plot of Spellwright?
Spellwright is an epic fantasy. Coincidentally, dyslexics don't usually do this, but sometimes when I'm nervous, I'll reverse the phonemes for things. And so every once in a while I'll say, oh, it's a fantic epic about dyslexia, and everybody will just die. It's an epic fantasy about a world in which what's written on the page can be taken off of the page and made physically real. And if you write the particular language down correctly and you cast the sentences into the air, they will fold and do what you like, and that will be a spell. It might make something levitate, might bend enough light to make somebody invisible. But were you to put the letters down incorrectly or punctuate them incorrectly or construct them wrong, it might fall apart, it might blow up, it might wrap around your neck. That would be a misspell. So in this world, people who can create these languages are very powerful, but people who misspell are exceedingly dangerous. And so the conceit focuses around a young man who was so good at producing this language that he was once thought to be kind of important to the destiny of these civilizations, one of prophecy. But he has this immense disability which has disqualified him from those considerings. And the story is, in a lot of ways, the traditional classic epic story. But in my opinion, what really the part of it that allows me to kind of cook with grease and feel like I'm innovating is it's really a struggle about a disability and like how you come to terms with yourself and with other people about disability and what it means about both yourself and the universe that disability exists, and how you come to cope with all of that.
I think that you got the idea while in biology class.
Oh yeah, so this is a fun story. So I was a double major, tried to be in chemistry and English, and ended up going just with English because Yale's kind of snotty and only will ever give you one degree. But so I was taking a lot of biochem and organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is wonderful for people who have minds that like to think in 3 dimensions, and though I cannot spell, that is one of my fortes, and I loved organic chemistry. And we were learning a lot about how molecules have to create languages of their own. And specifically, the languages we spend most of our time thinking about are, nucleotides, which make up your DNA, and polypeptides, which make up your proteins. And the two kind of different properties of these two languages, how they govern themselves, how they can go wrong and cause diseases such as cancer. And so I was spending a good amount of time in that regard. But I was also an English major, and I remember being in a really, really horribly boring seminar on Shakespearean and Greek tragedy. And at the time I wrote, still do sometimes, if I hear a new word, I will write in phonetic script. And so write out what the word sounds like rather than how I think it's actually spelled. And later I'll go back and look it up. But there was another fellow in this class, so we had kind of a rivalry going on. English majors out there will remember all the kind of the horrible didactic arguments people would break lances upon each other over. And we both liked and didn't like each other. At least we respected each other. And at some point, I'm writing down notes, and he leans over and sees that I'm writing in this phonetic language, and he taps it and he says, wow, you really did ride the short bus to school. And he's right. For 7 years I rode the short bus, and you get teased. You hear every single possible word, retard, et cetera, when you get off that short bus every morning. And so I remember saying something stupid, something totally inane, like, yeah, tell me about it, or just wait till you get an email from me or something like that. But in my mind, I had this insane image of peeling the words off of the page and kind of using them as a boxing glove and just knocking them one right in the kisser. And I fumed about it. And I was not at this time thinking, gee, I'll write like a fantasy about anything at any point. But then after the class, I remember walking around still kind of fuming and feeling like I don't belong here. That guy, he clearly is a Yaley and I'm not. And how did I get here? And if you've ever stopped by New Haven, which is a lovely town, you should check out Yale's architecture, which is modeled after the architecture of Cambridge and Oxford, except for the singular advantage of cement. And they have rather spectacular gargoyles all over the place. And so when I was walking around and kind of moping about the fickleness of language, not just language that is written in English, which has this degenerate code and cannot be, it's so illogical and nonsensical, thinking about the universal code where you translate nucleotides into polypeptides and how it's degenerate and can go wrong, and the kind of the connections, the many different ways languages are important, and error in language kind of all wrapped up within a university, and with these strange gargoyles staring at me. In particular, the residential college I was a member of was Trumbull, which is a bit like Gryffindor. It's like the best college ever. Has one gargoyle known as it's in potty court, because the gargoyle there is clearly sitting on a toilet. And I remember kind of staring at him, and he was painted up, I think, like Spider-Man. They paint him every year. And all of a sudden it just bloomed in my mind, this world where there was this kind of uber language or meta language that behaved not just like English and not just like nucleotides, but kind of a combination for both.
Actually, in this interview I read with you, you mentioned some really cool sounding elements of the story. I'm reading about constructs, textual extensions, and subtexts. Can you explain?
Yeah. So, so let's say one of the very basic things you might do with a sentence would be to a magical sentence, that is, that you've put into the environment. You might just manipulate either the energy around you, change the light, or just the matter around you, move things around. But if you got really good at combining these magical languages, you could put them together in such a way that it would be kind of an existing spell that would be able to take in information and move information around. Just, two fundamentally different languages, one for moving energy and information and another for moving physical things. Again, back to the same idea that there's nucleotides for DNA that store information and memory, and polypeptides for proteins that move things around. Well, those are things that make up living beings. Those are two magical languages that make up living beings. And couldn't you do the same if you had these magical languages? So if you were really good at this language and at writing these things, if you were a really good author, you could make up a construct, which would be semi-self-aware, depending on how good you were, entity that you could write to do what you want. You would give it certain parameters and needs and wants, and have it take care of your house, or have it file the books in your library, or govern some other code. So that's the constructs. And the other aspect you're alluding to was an idea actually inspired by Daniel Abraham, whose books I think are really, it's just a crying shame not everyone's read The Long Price Quartet, because they're so brilliant. I kind of met him and was like babbling away in a fanboy way at him at Worldcon in Anaheim. I forget when that was, 06 maybe. And I was telling him about this, and he said, you can affect energy. Like, could you, like, how would a human mind interact with these texts? And it just added this idea of what I call quaternary cognition, which is, the texts that affect energy. If you're really good at it, you can write them in such a way that they interact with your mind. So you can actually write larger aspects of an author's mind, and you can think thoughts with this auxiliary textual mind in combination with your organic brain that would be unthinkable otherwise. And the way they couch it in this world, they say quaternary thoughts are thoughts, you cast this spell upon yourself and you can think previously unthinkable thoughts. I can't really go into what exactly those unthinkable thoughts are without spoiling, but it was just, and I owe Daniel tremendously for the inspiration, and it was a godsend.
Do you think that with the sort of rise of fiction podcasts and the popularity of audiobooks now, that's a way that kids who are struggling with dyslexia can sort of start to overcome that?
Oh, I think it's fantastic and wonderful, and I believe Scott Westerfeld, I don't know if he wrote it or pointed to it, but it was a blog that pointed out that listening to an audiobook now has gained some amount of credence as a valid form of reading. Back when I was young, we had mostly, you could buy the private tapes, but there was also a service called Recording for the Blind. That was also available to those of us with dyslexia, and it was a wonderful resource for us all. And the fact that now you can download it, and right now I have probably 50 or 60 audiobooks on my iPhone. I think audio media is not just relevant to the neurodivergent. I think it's useful for all kinds of kids. I think if you prefer to hear fiction spoken, I don't think there should be any embargo on that, especially considering that for most of history, reading was a social act. One person could read in a particular social environment, and you would listen to them read out loud. Reading in private has really been kind of an early modern invention.
So how did you get interested in medicine, and what sort of medicine do you study?
So both of my parents are psychiatrists, which is one of the reasons I'm very strange. They're both lovely people. Psychiatrists are lovely people, but they say funny things, and they view human beings kind of in a way that kind of takes some getting used to if you're from outside of the tribe of psychiatrists. So I had always, they had brought me up, telling me, you can do whatever you like, Blake, but medicine is wonderful for all these reasons. You get to help people, and you get to, there's a scientific part of things, there's an artistic component of it, et cetera, et cetera. So in my mind, I had always had the idea of medicine. That said, when I started writing for the first time, I was, as I mentioned before, I was the obnoxious rabid pre-med as an undergraduate. I just studied. I spent way too much time in the library and memorized things I didn't need to memorize, and it was bad. And I mentioned the dean of Trumbull College, Laura King. Dean King pulled me aside and helped me kind of get away from the kind of the rat pack or wolf pack, I should say, of rabid pre-meds and start to write. So for about 5 years there, when I first started writing Spell Right, rather naively thinking I'd just write a book and get it published, I left the fold. I finished all my pre-medical requirements, and I just chased this dream of becoming a novelist. And I, as many people do, I would rapidly run out of money, and would have to take some kind of work and then keep writing and then run out of money. And I accrued, like a lot of people, a lot of very interesting jobs. I used to drive people to the airport as kind of a gypsy taxi service for my neighborhood. I would clean out gutters. I would take contract work as a technical writer for UCSF and for Stanford Pediatrics. And then I became a boarding school teacher in the Northeast. I was a football coach. Wherever the wind would blow you and allow you to write for the longest time. I was pretty happy with that life. And then my father got very sick. He has a very rare form of cancer called angiosarcoma. And most of the time when you're diagnosed with it, I think the average life expectancy is like 4 months. It's a very scary cancer. My father's very fortunate that he had it in his skin on his chest. And cutaneous angiosarcoma is rare as legs on a fish. And so I came, my father and I, we weren't on the best terms, but it was terrifying. So I came back from the East Coast and was close to him and helped him to the best of the extent that I could. And, after all the surgeries and the chemotherapies, they kept pushing his expectation back. And going through this whole process and seeing what a boon a wonderful physician was, and how what a curse a bad physician was, and how physicians really can add to misery. And all healthcare workers can be both a boon and can kind of increase the anxiety and pain of disease. It was then, I thought, I felt the calling for the first time. I thought, yeah, I have to come back to this, right? Like for so long I wanted this, and there are physicians who write, and there's got to be some way I can pursue both. And the reason I ended up at Stanford was not just simply because it's close to my family, although it is, and that's wonderful, but because Stanford is very supportive of my aspirations of being both a physician and a writer and a novelist. And I have two wonderful mentors here who are very well-known novelists in their particular genres. So Stanford really has given me guidance from my mentors, but also I've completed the first 2 years of medical school, and now I'm on a fellowship in which I am forgiven tuition, but I am enrolled, in which they're allowing me to kind of finish up this phase of my writing career. So I don't really have a specialty. That was, I think, the original question. I don't have a specialty yet. I have to do about 1.5 years worth of clinical training, and then I have to apply to an internship and a residency. What I go into changes. If you ask me tomorrow, I might say something different, but now I'm most interested in general internal medicine and general pediatrics.
How much can I get for a kidney on the black market, do you think?
I think it's 20 to 30 years in jail.
Oh, okay. Well, that's not what I was really.
I wouldn't know.
What if it's like a 2-for-1 sale?
Well, you could divide the kidney, and then try, because we can do partial implants now.
Okay. Well, has studying medicine affected your writing at all?
Oh, most definitely. In fact, John, the story you bought from me, Endosymbiont, which you ran in your anthology, Seeds of Change, was inspired by a neurobiology and neuroscience class I was taking, and my encounters with an older patient who had survived cancer and some younger patients that, rather tragically were combating pediatric cancers.
How often are you called on to stab a syringe of adrenaline directly into somebody's heart? Is that like once a week, or?
That was just that one time at World Fantasy Con, and you had H1N1, and we were really worried about you.
Now, your full name is Blake Randolph Charlton.
Yeah.
Couldn't your parents have come up with a more pretentious sounding name?
Well, they could have. In fact, it was all in the hopper. I narrowly avoided becoming Randolph Seville Charlton III.
Whoa.
It's not, that makes it sound like we were like hanging out in our estates in Cheshire or something before we came across to America. But on my father's side, We come off of the bayou in Louisiana. If you had heard my grandfather speak, you wouldn't have been able to understand much of what he was saying.
And even without the Randolph in there, people still tend to assume your name is a pseudonym, right?
Yeah, so when so I had written Spellwright and gotten an agent, and I was 25, so that was 5 years from start to acquiring an agent. The fellow who ended up being my editor over at Tor called me up, and he said, now don't be offended, because people do this all the time, but Blake Charlton can't really be your name, can it? And that was not me. And he was thrilled because Blake Charlton, it's very memorable, and it's apparently, this is terribly important, it's early on in the alphabet. And so my books will be placed, people start scanning, I suppose, at A and start going down, and they usually get to C. So he was ecstatic with the name, which we all in my family thought was pretty hilarious.
Yeah, I've heard that authors whose last names start with A, B, or C sell 20% better or something on average than other authors.
Which just sounds insane. And does that mean everyone's going to have to change their name to, Alan Cadabra or something?
Garth Nix is another author whose name just sounds like it couldn't possibly be his real name. It's
right.
Just such a perfect name for a fantasy writer. I actually had a student one year who wanted to be a fantasy writer whose name was Lindsay Dragon. And, she actually asked one of the guests, should I use the pseudonym because people are just going to think my name is this dumb pseudonym.
Awesome.
So you mentioned reading Tad Williams books when you were in school, and I understand now that you're good friends with Tad Williams and that you guys met playing basketball. Was that?
Yeah, great story there. I will tell you my version, and I'm 100% sure Tad will tell you that I'm speaking only lies. But so when I was first starting to write, I returned home and would go to the local Palo Alto YMCA, and I would play pickup basketball games in this lunchtime league. And there was this other fellow there who also had a shaved head, who also played predominantly in the low post, and who is also a bit of a bruiser. I will admit to my low post game is not gentle, but I thought he just took it over the top, and there was a lot of shoving and insisting that there were fouls when there were not. And at some point, I thought he just blatantly fouled me. He'll tell you the opposite is true, that I fouled him. But at some point, we get into this almost yelling match, and I'm like, who do you think you are? Who are you? And he, is not really paying attention. He's like, I'm Tad Williams or something, in some context. And in the middle of this yelling match, I'm like, wait a minute. Are you the Tad Williams? The Tad Williams? Did you write the Dragon Boat Chair? And he looks at me and says, well, yeah, I did. And I'm like, that book meant a whole lot to me.
Then it was like man hugs all around.
No, Tad was like, well, that's nice, but I didn't foul you, and you're a whiny little man. And for about a year longer, we became friends, and I would always try to butter Tad up and be like, so can I show you something I've written? Can I tell you about my fantasy idea? And he always was very polite and kind of patted me on my shiny head and said, Blake, I like you a lot, but no way. I'm sorry, I just can't. I can't read every fan and recommend everybody who's starting out on their way. And then kind of by hook and by crook on my own other methods, all of a sudden I started getting agents asking me. And I had 2 agents actually who said, yes, I'd like to represent you. And I was trying to decide between them. And I was looking at their client list, and actually one of them is Tad's agent. And that day, going to play basketball that day, and telling him so was probably one of the best of my life. So even though he wasn't going to read the book or anything like that, all of a sudden his agent was interested in me, and then he read a draft and was actually interested, and he ended up writing a wonderful blurb for the book.
Are there other writers who have helped you out along the way?
Robin, in terms of inspiration, Robin Hobb was one of the earliest kind of books that just kind of I felt like the world was melting under me when I read her, and anything she writes. I love to get my hands on her work. I think she's fantastic. Ursula K. Le Guin, of course, I owe a tremendous debt to her. I don't know her, but her work literacy books, this idea of true names and kind of a sort of a magical language, and being able to modify the world by knowing the true names for things, of course, was one of the bedrock upon which I built my magic system.
Okay, well, Blake Charlton, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Fantastic. It was a pleasure to talk to you guys.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Blake for joining us on the show. So when he was talking about how in his world, how mixing up one letter or getting one letter wrong can make the spell completely backfire and have horrible consequences, it was kind of reminding me of one of my all-time favorite video games, which is King's Quest III. Did you ever play this one?
I'm not sure about 3, but I've definitely played the King Quest series.
So in 3, this is the one where you're sort of a teenage boy and you've been enslaved to an evil wizard, and so you live at his house on top of this mountain, and he constantly just appears and tells you to do chores, and you're not allowed to enter certain rooms of the house. You're not allowed to leave the mountain. Then every once in a while, the wizard will go away on a voyage, and then you have to start ransacking the house, and you discover that there's this underground lab where he does all of his magic. And, you realize that if you can just learn some magic, you'll be able to defeat him. But a lot of the spells require ingredients that aren't in the house, and so he'll go away on trips and then come back and go away. And while he's away, you have to sneak down into the valley and gather up ingredients and mix up magic spells and then have everything hidden, hide all the magic stuff away and clean up everything before he gets back. And so it's just a really cool game dynamic where it's not like you're an adventurer going around killing monsters. You have to really be sneaky and clever and really think about what you're doing and be careful. But the part that relates to what Blake was talking about is that when you get all these ingredients and you start mixing up the spells, there's sort of these complicated recipes for creating the spells, and if you do anything wrong at all, you die instantly. Mm-hmm. And this is a text parser game, so if you misspell a word or something, you die instantly. And so when you go into the mode where you're going to be preparing these spells, it starts playing creepy music, and just as a kid, I was like, oh man, and you just die over and over and over again because you're a kid, you don't know how to spell every word, and you're just not that good at following directions and stuff. But it would really make you feel like you're really doing magic. And when you finally got a new spell, it wouldn't just be like in most games where you just go up a level and you have a new ability or something. You feel like you really went through an ordeal to acquire this new power. It was making me think of all those old games and how I really liked the text parser games. And Blake was talking about how much fantasy books helped him learn how to read because they really motivated him. And those old adventure games were just like the best tool I could imagine for learning how to read, because there's a lot of text on the screen that you have to read, and you have to type to interact with the world, and you have to spell words right, because if you say look under bridge and you misspell bridge, the game doesn't know what you're talking about and it just gives you an error message. And so I really learned so much from playing those games, and it kind of broke my heart when they stopped using the text parser and went to the point and click interface, and a little bit of the magic went out of the world on that day. So I wonder, like, if I don't really know like what games like 8-year-olds are playing today, but I wonder if they have those same sorts of, like I watch my younger cousins playing Mario Kart or Super Smash Brothers or something that look like fun, but they don't seem to have any kind of real redeeming value,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think I must have learned a lot from those types of games as well, because I played a lot of them, and I know the Ultimate games, which we've talked about before, also use that sort of thing where, you had to actually ask questions and, use text to interact with the game. But, and then there's also the just plain text-based adventure games like Zork, which is completely text, and you're just like interacting with a story, basically. And actually, my sister used to write those for me. Like, she would create a custom text-based adventure game for me, like, on her TRS-80. But, I think those things definitely help kids a lot. There's one game I know of currently that is sort of fulfilling that same sort of need. There's a game on the Nintendo DS called Scribblenauts. It's like a sort of adventure game, but you actually write words onto the screen, and then like it makes it appear, and you can use it to like get through stages and stuff. And so, like, for instance, like on Twitter, Deanna Hook was talking about her son who was playing Scribblenauts, and he asked her how to spell zombie case, but he meant sarcophagus. But and so she tells him how to spell sarcophagus, and so he puts it there, and then he opens it, and then a mummy comes out and like kills him. And so it's like, it does various different things like that in the game. And so it's like, just because you write something doesn't mean it's going to help you. And I'm like, why would he open the sarcophagus? That doesn't make it. That's bad.
Yeah, well, it's funny you should mention your sister programming the text games for you, because the first text adventure game I ever played, it was just called Adventure. I think it was an iteration of an earlier game called Colossal Cave Adventure. But the story I heard was that there was a father, and he really liked to go cave exploring, and he got divorced, and so he didn't see his daughter a lot, and so he wrote the adventure game. It was originally you could just explore this cave, and it was like this real cave system that he liked to explore, and so he could send a copy of this game to his daughter, and then she could kind of explore his favorite cave.
That's awesome. No, when you were saying that Blake's description of the magic system reminded you of King's Quest, it's funny because this is something that you're also a fan of, at least to some degree, but it reminded me of Gummy Bears, the Disney cartoon that was on like in the 80s, I guess. But there was a wizard on the show who he had like aphasia or else he just spoke in malapropisms all the time or something. I'm not sure what the disorder was, but he always like screwed up the order of his words. I used to play D&D when I was a teenager a lot, and there was a character in our group that who was a wizard, and his name was Aphasia, which just seems appropriately ironic.
It sounds like from what Blake is describing that he's really worked it out very carefully, that the magic is almost a science in his world that follows rules and things. And it seems to me that's a really interesting debate going on in fantasy about whether magic should follow rules or not. When I think of the view that magic should follow rules, the biggest proponent that kind of comes to mind is Brandon Sanderson, who I guess works out really detailed, complex magic systems for each of his series and things. And I've heard him say that the reason he does that is because he doesn't want it to be, one of the things that makes fiction interesting is that you can predict what's going to happen, is that there is foreshadowing and, a structure to the story. And, you don't want it to be the case where your hero has been cornered in a dark alley and you're like, how is he going to get out of this? And then he just flies up to the roof and runs away. And you're like, oh, I didn't know he could fly. If the reader isn't given a chance to anticipate what the character is going to do, then it's not as interesting. And I guess you have this problem with superheroes a lot, is that the writers will kind of write themselves into a corner, and they'll sort of invent some new power or some new application of a power to get the character out of that situation. And so the longer a superhero goes, the more and more power they accumulate until it's gotten to the point where you can't come up with anything to challenge them anymore because they've become so powerful. And so they have to reduce the amount of power that the character has. And I guess they call this nerfing the characters when they sort of dial back their power. So like in the original Superman movie, Superman is apparently able to fly around the Earth and like make time go backwards and fix everything. And obviously they had to nerf him in subsequent movies because it's just like, well, that's just way too powerful. How can you possibly have any kind of story if Superman can just make time go backwards and fix everything?
Yeah, but no, I mean, speaking of having structure for magic, I mean, I think that's really essential to making something really interesting as a fantasy. I mean, I think that's one of the things I don't like about the Harry Potter books. I mean, I actually do quite enjoy them, but I mean, the magic system in the books, it seems like they can just do whatever they want whenever they want, and there's no particular cost associated with anything. So I'm like, why don't they use magic all the time to do everything? Because there never seems to be any reason not to. I mean, I think a good magic system will have a sophisticated system for having there be some cost associated with every action. Every magical action you take, you're going to lose something. It's either going to be like, you'll lose some bit of your life, or, you have a limited amount of mana or something that you can use at any one time and you have to recharge or something, I mean, it's like there's got to be something that prevents you from just using magic all the time, because otherwise the world would just be chaos. Fantasy without rules just is very uninteresting.
Okay, well, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because, there are some pretty heavy hitters on the other side of this argument. So, like, first of all, we would have George R. R. Martin, right? And so he says, that he doesn't like it. I kind of like what you're saying is in Harry Potter, that he doesn't like it when, wizards are just always throwing fireballs at each other. And if magic is as predictable and rules-based as science, then it just becomes as mundane as science in a sense. I mean, it's if you've never seen a light bulb before, it's really cool that you can just cause illumination. But if you could just flip a switch and every single time the light comes on, whether it's magic or technology doing that, if that's the kind of the nature of it, it just ceases to be wondrous. And so, like in his Song of Ice and Fire series, he makes the magic really rare. And every time something magical happens, it's something really unexpected and unique. Every single thing is a sort of subversion of reality. China Mieville has a really good example that he uses where he says he's talking about the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game based on the horror world of H.P. Lovecraft. And in Lovecraft's world, there's this evil god called Cthulhu. And the whole point of the series is that Cthulhu is beyond comprehension. Any attempt to even try to understand what he is will drive you insane. And he's just so far beyond, human quantification. He's just on another plane of existence. And then you look in the rule book for the role-playing game, and it says, Cthulhu, 50 feet tall, strength 100. And it totally misses the point that it's just, it's trying to quantitate. It actually is quantifying this thing, that the whole point is that it's supposed to be unquantifiable. And so then the last example that sort of sprang to mind is in the ending of Nightmare on Elm Street. In Nightmare on Elm Street, there's this freaky evil entity named Freddy Krueger who comes to kids in their dreams and kills them. And if Freddy kills you in your dreams, you die in the real world. And so once the kids start realizing this, they start trying to stay awake for as long as they can to try to figure out how they can save themselves, because they know if they fall asleep, Freddy's going to get them. And so then at the end, it seems like they've defeated Freddy and everything's fine, and they all get into a car to go to the mall or something. And then the car is like a Freddy Krueger car, and it locks them in and drives off with them, and they're all screaming. And there was no possible way you could anticipate that this is going to happen. And it's kind of dumb in a way, but it's also kind of unsettling. I've never been able to forget that scene because it doesn't follow any rules, and that's scary. That you can't just be like, oh, well, Freddy is a level 10 monster, so he has these abilities.
You see that, and you're like, oh, wow, that was scary and awesome. But then if you think about it, you're like, well, why didn't he just do that before? I mean, why was he fooling around with all this dream stuff before if he could just, create this evil Freddy Krueger car and get them whenever he wanted to? You know what I mean? I mean, that's what I was getting at with, talking about the having limitations or costs on magic. I mean, as far as Martin is concerned, there's so little magic in that world. You can read those books and be like, and you can get to the end and be like, oh wait, yeah, I guess it is fantasy. I mean, I guess there's some magic in there, but it's like, it just feels like an alternate, historical series for the most part. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's another way of making magic work without having these hard, strictly defined rules. But I mean, I think if you have a heavy, a high volume magic world, I think you really have to have rules in place, otherwise it just gets to be ridiculous, like I was saying, where there's nothing to stop people from just using magic all the time, and then it just doesn't make any sense if you think about it. I mean, not that ever stops Hollywood movies from ever doing things like that. I mean, that's half my problem with movies a lot of times, is that it's like, oh wow, yeah, that was cool, but then when you stop and think about it and you actually think about the actions that lead up to all these different decisions, it's like, well, this doesn't make any sense, because they could have just subverted the whole movie by doing this, or this, It all depends on how much of a suspension of disbelief, I guess, you're willing to give the work. But, I mean, there's situations where, like with Harry Potter, I mean, even though it has that issue, I still am able to enjoy it and have fun. It's just that I think it limits it from being a great work of fantasy.
Well, I think another issue a lot of times with fantasy worlds that have magic in them is that they look just like our world, except with magic. And the author hasn't really taken into consideration, well, wait, if magic existed, it wouldn't just look like our world with magic. It would change everything about the world. So an example, like you were talking about Dungeons and Dragons. In Dungeons and Dragons, there are big castle, medieval style castles all over the landscape. Because in our world, it's really, if you want to keep people out, it's really good to build some tall walls, because then people have trouble getting over them. But in the Dungeons and Dragons world, every level 7 ranger or whatever gets a flying mount, and every fairly low level wizard can cast transmute stone to mud, right? So I mean, how effective is a castle going to be when even fairly low level characters can go right through a wall or right over a wall? And
right.
So would anyone really go to the trouble of building castle walls in the first place?
And does it make sense that the people ruling the world are not all wizards?
Mm-hmm.
Because why would there ever be a court wizard? Why would a wizard ever put up with the ruler unless he was also a powerful wizard? And in which case, why would he need a court wizard? Yeah, so no, it doesn't really make sense if you think about it. And again, it's you can still have fun in those situations, but it doesn't really make sense if you break it down. Although at least D&D does have limitations put on power. You can only cast a certain number of spells per day, and you have to go up in levels before you can attempt certain spells. You have to be a certain level of experience. But it's not going to make sense if you really, really analyze it. I mean, I think what Blake is talking about and what the sort of the movement in fantasy is called is hard fantasy. So if that's the sort of magic system you're interested in, if you look up hard fantasy authors, that's just going to be the sort of thing you would find. So Sean Williams is another author recently who had a series came out that is deemed hard fantasy.
But I mean, speaking of, the world being changed if magic was real, I mean, this is something I really wonder about is, you have these people who are burning Harry Potter books because they don't want their kids getting mixed up in witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
And at least the impression I get is that they think that witchcraft is actually real and efficacious. And I sort of want to ask them, if you think people can actually cast spells in our world and they work, wouldn't that change everything about our world? I mean, wouldn't you just go on YouTube and it would be nothing but videos of angry teenagers summoning demons in their basements, and wouldn't every evil corporation have a whole team of witches, they have big teams of lawyers now just to do what they want? And like you were saying, wouldn't wizards rule the world? Wouldn't every ruler of every sort of evil country or be some sort of witch or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's why a lot of times the fact that wizards exist is always a secret. For instance, in Harry Potter, the wizarding world exists, but in secret of most of the population. And they always they have these rules about not letting Muggles see you do magic.
But I mean, how could you possibly keep something like that secret? I mean,
no.
Because
they have magic.
Yeah, but I mean, they're always they're always flying around in their car, and doesn't anybody ever get this on video or something? I mean, everyone's got a camera on their phone and everything,
That's what Men in Black are for.
But actually, speaking of wizards ruling the world, I had a couple examples of kind of interesting portrayals of magic in fiction that I wanted to mention. And so the first one is a book called Illusion by Paul Volsky. And so it's kind of the French Revolution retold, in a fantasy world. And so in this world, the ruling class are all people who have a sort of hereditary ability to do magic. And so a young woman, upper-class young woman, goes to the capital, and at a party she sees, a wizard sort of cast an illusion spell. And it's just this really kind of sad, pitiful illusion spell. And everyone claps, and they're all amazed because this is the most impressive thing they've seen in years. And she realizes how far magic has fallen because these people have all just kind of become lazy, sort of indolent aristocrats. And so then, that obviously sets the stage for a big revolution. But one thing I've never forgotten from this book is that there are 3 almost robot machines that they keep in the palace that are called the Sentients, except nobody's been able to get them to work for years. And so they've kind of jokingly become known as the Stupefactions. And somebody is able to get them working again. And one of them is this really scary, I remember it being sort of a Sphinx type thing. And, all the upper class people are trying to sneak out of the city. And so this Sphinx sort of thing sort of sits above the gate, and it can read people's minds. And so it always knows if anyone passing through the gate is an upper class person trying to escape. And so what they start doing is they start drugging themselves so that they're unconscious, and so then it can't read their minds. And there's just this really memorable scene where this creature is looking at this card, and it just knows there's something not quite right about it, but it just doesn't know what's wrong. But it's because there's somebody who's unconscious, but they're just the magical machine is just picking up just sort of slight mental vibrations.
One example that I always liked of magic systems is also something that you were fond of, but the Robert Aspirin Myth series, which we've talked about on the show before, I think. In that, the magicians, they use force lines. So it's they sort of there's these sort of invisible power lines that run across in a grid like throughout the world or whatever. And so like you, as a magician, you would draw power from these power lines. And so like if you're far away from one or whatever, you might not be able to access it and so forth.
Yeah, and one thing I really like about those books, and you see it right from the beginning in the first book, Another Fine Myth, is that all magic is done with your mind. It's all just mental effort, but wizards still do all sorts of rituals and things just to impress people. And so at the very beginning, the characters need some money, and so one of the characters, asks, one of the other characters, Skeeve, is there any money lying around here? And Skeeve says, well, there is, but it's all cursed. And Az just kind of laughs and explains that this is just a story that wizards make up to keep people from stealing their stuff, that there's no such things as curses. When I was into Dungeons and Dragons, when I was kind of a teenager, the world I was most into was called Dark Sun. And it's basically, it's sort of a Mad Max version of Middle-earth. So it's a world in which there's kind of two kinds of magic, sort of like the light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force. And the dark side of the Force kind of magic is called defiling. And it actually sucks energy out of the world around you and sort of destroys life. And then there's sort of good magic, which is more of a give and take and doesn't destroy life, but is slower and harder. And so you can either choose to be a defiler or a preserver. And if you're a defiler, you'll go up in levels a lot faster and gain powers a lot faster, but know that you're kind of a bad person. But so basically the whole world is just this big wasteland because so much defiling magic has been done by so many people over so many centuries that it's just basically destroyed the ecology of this entire world. That they wrote novels in this world, and I was reading one of them when I was a kid on a day where I was homesick from school, and I had just the most horrible fever you could possibly imagine, and I was actually delusional. And in this book, it turns out that there's gladiatorial combat is popular in this world, and it turns out that one of the evil sorcerer kings who rule this world has a plot to cast a spell that involves thousands of human sacrifices. So he's just going to lock the whole audience into one of his gladiatorial arenas and kill them all. And the heroes get wind of this, and so they have to try to stop him. And I can remember just like lying on the floor, just sweating and being completely delusional and thinking, that I had to get up because I had to go save the world from this evil sorcerer king. And that was actually really cool. And so I've often thought since then that there must be some kind of a market for some sort of drug or something that could put you into a delusional state. So you would actually think that the book or the movie you were watching was really happening, while it was going on.
Get on that, science. That's that Dark Sun example is an excellent example of what I was talking about with the having the cost for magic. And that's a really, really cool cost. That you're either destroying the world or else you just have like sort of weaker magic that is more in harmony. But that sort of ties in with the sort of not too subtle environmental message of the setting. But you mentioned Star Wars too, and that in and of itself is a perfectly good example of a magic system. The light side and the dark side is whether or not the Force is technically magic, it sure seems like magic. Because if you're talking about Star Wars with any sort of strict definitions, it's not really science fiction. It's fantasy that uses the furniture of science fiction, so it sort of looks like science fiction, but it's really not, since not much of it really makes sense by any scientific standpoint, and certainly not the Force doesn't.
I read an analysis once of the Star Wars movies, which essentially argued that each new Force power that is introduced is just a plot convenience, that obviously there was no system from the beginning. Earlier, we were talking about power just sort of getting out of control and having to be nerfed and stuff. And so I guess there's been a big issue in the Star Wars universe where Yoda says size doesn't make any difference. As far as the Force is concerned, a rock is the same as a spaceship. And so the logical extension of that is that you should just be able to, if a Star Destroyer is attacking a planet, you should just be able to shove it back out into space with just one person using the Force, right? Because it's just like you doing a rock, right? Mm-hmm. And this completely unbalances the whole world. So another example of magic I've always thought was kind of cool is in Roger Zelazny's Amber Chronicles. In the first series, it's established that the characters can draw pictures. If you have a special ability, you can draw a picture of a person or a place and then use that image to contact that person or to step through into that place. And so in between the time he wrote that series and the second series, computers started becoming more common. And so he kind of, I guess, started thinking about, well, how could a computer interface with this ability? And so one of the characters is kind of a computer science student, and so he makes an AI kind of machine that can use computer graphics to just draw hundreds of these images in a second, and this gives it all sorts of amazing powers, and it becomes very, very dangerous.
Yeah, Jeremiah Tolbert has a series of stories that he's written. The first one was in the Shimmer Pirate issue that I edited, but it's about a world where magic has been copyrighted by this large group of powerful wizards, sort of like the RIAA, the Recording Industry of America. And so they basically copyrighted all the magic. And so, the protagonist of the story is like a guy who pirates, magic spells on the internet. And it's like this just great blend of technology and magic that I really like. And I always kind of wonder, like in Harry Potter, for instance, I'm like, do they have email? Because like, why are they sending owls to each other? They can just send email. Come on. I mean, it would make sense though. Like if, as if you were saying, like, well, would the world really look like the world that we know if, magic existed? And so like, I could totally understand if email did not exist because there was magic, because like, why would you bother inventing something like email if you could just magic a message to somebody? But, that doesn't seem to be the case. It's just that there's no mention almost of any technology. I mean, they do mention computers at some point, but, those wizards, they never send email or anything. It's really weird. Or text each other. Come on, they're kids.
Blake described Yale as kind of like Hogwarts with more beer. Mm-hmm. And that was making me think of this recent book by Lev Grossman called The Magicians, which it's basically like Harry Potter goes to college. I think that's a really great premise. And I really enjoyed this book a lot. This sort of the idea is that, sometimes you'll just think that something is going to be so cool, like some new, some summer camp or some new job or something. And then you get there and you're kind of like, I don't know about this. It's not at all how I thought it would be. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. And so it kind of takes that idea and applies it to magic school and to, going to a magical realm, where, it's not quite what you expected. And sometimes it just seems like a big disaster. And you're like, oh, why did I ever come here? But then, it's much more, ambivalent, than most, stories about going to a fantasy world tend to be. And I guess the book, from what I've read, has elicited fairly polarized reactions, but I really got a kick out of it. And I think especially if you're, like in high school or in college, that would be I wish I could have read it back when I was that age.
So one of the other things I wanted to talk about that Blake brought up, because he's a doctor and because, his story Endosymbiont is basically like a medical science fiction story, I kind of wanted to talk about medicine in science fiction and the sort of subgenre of not science fiction called medical thrillers. Because, I grew up reading a bunch of medical thrillers before I got into reading science fiction, and they were kind of a gateway for me. So Robin Cook is like the first author I sort of latched onto in the medical thrillers, genre. But, he's a doctor and he's just writing, taking medical scenarios and making an adventure, sort of a thriller story out of it, so there's like a murder mysteries going on and stuff. But the one most relevant to science fiction fans, I think, is he has this book called Chromosome 6, in which scientists are somewhere in Africa. They're using bonobo apes to grow human organs in them, like to serve as transplantation purposes, like for rich people. So like instead of waiting on an organ donor list, like, you could pay this group of scientists to clone you an organ and grow it inside the body of a bonobo, and then they would, make the transplant and all that. There's a lot of crossover with this in science fiction otherwise. Like, there's a Robert J. Sawyer novel called The Terminal Experiment, which is one of the books that helped me get into science fiction, really, because it was this new book that came out right around the time I was reading all these medical thrillers and sort of tentatively wading into science fiction. And here was this new book that came out, and it had a caduceus on the cover. And I was like, hey, I know what that is. That's a medical thing. So in the Terminal Experiment, it's about a guy trying to prove that life after death exists or not. And so it has this sophisticated computer experiment in which he has these 3 different simulations, and one of them is a control, and then one of them sort of tries to simulate life after death, and one of them, tries to simulate something else. But then it's determined that one of these simulations somehow commits a murder. Like, it's a computer simulation, but it somehow gets out into the internet, and through the internet it somehow kills somebody. But it was like this really cool, like, murder mystery, trying to figure out, like, what happened and who done it. And it was really interesting because it deals with all these sort of philosophical questions about religion and the soul and life after death and that kind of thing. So for a skeptical, a skeptic interested in medicine, it was a really good gateway to help me get into science fiction more. And one of the other things that I pursued alongside the medical thrillers, or there's a series by Patricia Cornwell about a medical examiner called named Case Carpetta, and she has this series of books that were quite popular. But a medical examiner is like is a coroner, or they do autopsies on murder victims and that kind of thing, and they sort of help the police investigate suspicious deaths. And so I mean that's another sort of tangentially related to science fiction, just because it's like so science oriented. I mean, I think a lot of detective stuff sort of is appealing to science fiction fans a lot because of that. I mean, one of the other things to do with medicine and science fiction is there's actually a pretty good tradition in science fiction of blending those two things. Like James White has a series of novels called the Sector General series. Began, I think, with Hospital Station in the 60s, and there was 12 books or so. But it sort of follows this. It's sort of a Star Trek-like situation where you have the Interstellar Federation, and you're flying around on spaceships and going to space stations, and it follows this doctor. So there's that, and then also S.L. Veal has a series called Stardock, which is sort of along the same lines.
But when you were talking about sort of the similarities, in a sense, between mystery and science fiction, I really agree with that, and I do think that they appeal to a lot of the same impulses in readers. But I mean, one thing I've noticed with mysteries, I think a problem for a mystery that's presented to you as a mystery is that kind of gives too much away, right? If you know going into it that one of these people is going to be the murderer, then really no matter who it is, you're not going to be that surprised, right? I mean, once you've read enough of them, you kind of get the idea. And one thing I've noticed is that when you tell people, oh, this movie has a great twist at the end,
mm-hmm.
that usually they're able to guess what it is, within the first 5 minutes or something. That most
mm-hmm.
good twists are so implicit in the premise that if you know a big twist is coming, it's easy to guess it, right? And
I totally agree.
And that a movie, in order for a movie with a big twist to succeed, you have to not know that there's a big twist in it. And so, like, a mystery story kind of telegraphs, that there's going to be a surprise at the end, or that
mm-hmm.
it's going to try to, trick you at the end. And so, I mean, one thing I like about science fiction is that you can have a sort of puzzle story where it is a kind of mystery, but you don't realize it's a mystery until you're already, like, what is the aliens? The aliens might have some strange motivation, and once you figure it out, you're like, oh, now I understand what's been going on, or time travel was involved, and you're like, oh, I see how the time travel explains everything, but I didn't know that there was time travel. I didn't know that was something I was supposed to try to figure out.
Actually, that's something that Jack McDevitt is really good at. If you like that sort of story. He has a series following the character Alex Benedict. It doesn't really have a series name, but Alex Benedict is the protagonist. But that series is explicitly just a blend of mystery and science fiction, and it's like far future spaceship sort of science fiction, but it's also a mystery. But his other major series, the Omega series, sort of deals with what you were just saying about with the aliens being involved, and it's another sort of far future spaceship thing. But there's also these weird aliens that are like doing things that people like the humans don't really understand, and as you progress further along into the series, it is a really big mystery, like what's going on.
And the last thing I wanted to talk about is Blake was saying a little bit how it's actually kind of a modern invention, people sitting in a corner by themselves reading a book, and how for most of human history, reading or storytelling was much more of a social activity. And I feel like in a lot of ways that human beings are evolved to live in tribes on the African savannah, and we've changed the world completely from that in ways to make it more comfortable and convenient for ourselves. But in a way, we've left behind a lot of things that we're just innately suited for. And so, I mean, this is something that really strikes me. My family are big backpackers, and so we'll spend weeks out in the woods hiking around. And when you're just sitting around with everybody around the campfire at night, there's just something about that just feels right. And that, it's just not the same as sitting around the TV, and everybody telling stories, and you sort of get to know everybody who's on the trip with you. And, we always meet lots of people who want to be writers, and there's just far more people who want to be writers and who are really good at it than the market can possibly accommodate. But when you think about it, I mean, the way we evolved in tribes of 100 people or so, probably each tribe of 100 people needed, 5 or 7 people who were really good storytellers to keep the tribe motivated and going and to preserve history and stuff. And so, that works out to a certain fairly high percentage of the population who's just kind of programmed, I would say, with this storytelling instinct. But with mass-produced media, Stephen King can essentially provide this storytelling for the entire world, if necessary. And I think that's kind of, it's great in a way, but it's sad in a way too. It just sort of leaves a lot of people with this kind of impulse, but no outlet for it.
Maybe someone should go back in time and kill Gutenberg before he invented the damn printing press.
Well, I mean, I've kind of been hopeful a little bit that the internet might alleviate this to some extent. That there will, we have seen sort of this sort of evolution of more niche things and online communities and things, and it seems to be more and more that people aren't reading bestsellers, but they're reading stuff by friends of friends of friends. Andy Warhol famously said that in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. And there's this joke now that on the internet, everyone is famous to 15 people. And I think that's actually a good state of affairs if we can get to that. I mean, right now, celebrities have millions of people worshiping them, and they couldn't care less. And, most people, I think, would be perfectly happy with a enthusiastic audience of 15 people or something. And so if we can just sort of have more kind of attention equality, I think everyone would be a lot happier. Because I certainly like reading. I wish, as a writer, that there were more sort of social outlets for me to just read my stories to audiences. I mean, I do it sometimes, but certainly nowhere near as often as I would like. And it's just hard to, people are like, oh, I have to watch Lost. It's hard to like get people to come to stuff. And, like you could go to a writer's group, but then, you're only interacting with other writers. And then at the end, they don't say, hey, that was great, Dave. Thanks for a fun evening. They say, okay, here's everything you did wrong, and here's what I think you should fix, And certainly that can be valuable, but it would be nice to just have an audience, just an appreciative audience,
Well, you should go to more conventions, Dave. You can get a reading at every convention you go to. Of course, then you're paying a lot of money to, fulfill that need of yours to read to people.
Well, I guess now I have a podcast. So, if more people would post comments, if 15 people would post a comment, I would be happy.
That would make me happy as well. Although I would honestly, I would hope for more than 15. I guess I'm just greedy that way.
And that was our show. Thanks everyone for joining us. And be sure to join us next week when we'll interview Carrie Vaughn, author of the best-selling Kitty Norville series about a werewolf who runs a radio phone-in show for supernatural creatures. See you then.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Tor.com. For this episode's show notes or to subscribe to this podcast, visit Tor.com and click on Podcasts. For more information about your hosts, visit JohnJosephAdams.com or DavidBarrCurrently.com. Music and voiceover produced by Deadsville 9 Entertainment. If you've enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.